We turn now to our second of the social psychology studies we're going to discuss. This one is somewhat more famous these days than the work of Harry Harlow. This is the work of Stanley Milgram, who in 1961 conducted an infamous experiment in which volunteers took part in an experiment ostensibly to study human memory, but that was not what was actually going on. You can see the advertisement for the original experiment there. We will pay you $4 for 1 hour of your time. Persons needed for a study of memory. As I said, that's a lie, straightforward lie. And they went out of their way in this ad to look for people who were not familiar with the university environment. No special training, education, or experience needed. They're reaching out specifically to factory workers, laborers, clerks, salespeople, construction workers, and the like. Now, the study is going to be conducted in Yale University, which is an Ivy League university in New Haven, Connecticut. Very, very prestigious institution. And so, from the get-go, people who take part in this study are going to be in a very unfamiliar environment, and specifically one in which the scientist carries an awful lot of authority. People are paid to take part in this study. They're paid $4 plus 50 cents car fare, which I suppose in those days was a little bit of money. There's some links there for further information and more detail than we can go into here about the experiment. Volunteers in this experiment arrived at the university and were greeted by a scientist wearing a white coat. They were then told that they were randomly assigned to one of two roles, that of learner or that of teacher. In fact, every volunteer played the role of teacher, and the learner was always an actor, a stooge, who was playing according to a script. But the volunteers didn't know that. The teacher, then the volunteer, is seated in a room with the experimenter, as you see on the right. And the so-called learner is in a different room and is visible through a glass, I think a one-way mirror partition. And the teacher sits in front of that rather intimidating box there. And while the experimenter reads out questions to the listener, when the learner gets something wrong, the teacher administers an electric shock by pushing a button on that device. And as time goes on, then the amount of electricity delivered is increased. No actual shocks were administered. Everything here is staged, but I repeat, the volunteers did not know that. The line of switches on that device controls the nominal voltage, which is believed to be implied, and it goes from 15 volts, which might be unpleasant, to 450 volts, which is very much in the do not use territory. The script required that the learner produced certain responses as the voltage reached certain thresholds. So at 120 volts, the learner shouted in pain. At 150 volts, the learner would ask to stop if they ever got there. At 300 volts, the learner would pound on the wall. At 330 volts, the learner would stop responding, and it's a long way to go to 450 volts. The real question being asked by this experiment, of course, was how far will these volunteers who've been assigned the role of teacher go? At what point will they refuse to take part in the experiment? Now, there were predictions made initially, and it was predicted that because a few people in any given population are psychopaths, maybe 2% of people might go all the way. And what they found was 65% of the teachers went to the maximum level. Can you imagine what that's like to take part in this experiment? You believe yourself to be administering electric shocks throughout that script, right up to the point at which the learner stops responding. It was a very, very unpleasant situation for volunteers. Now remember, you're in a room with a scientist, a figure of authority who's clearly marked as such. You are in close proximity to them. They are urging you on. When you express any ambivalence about what's going on, they insist that you go on, that the experiment requires it. And remember the disparity. The subjects here are poorly educated. Needless to say, this experiment is ethically very, very flawed. It is a torture, a form of torture administered to the subjects. We can watch a little bit of the footage here. There's more at the links that I provided on the first slide. But here's one of the learners in the course of the experiment. One of the teachers, sorry, in the course of the experiment.
Next one, tame. Wolf, bear, dog, cat. Wrong. Answer is bear. 240 volts. Next one, sweet.
No, you go back up to the beginning of that page and go through it again until he's learned them all correctly.
Oh, no. No, I'm not going to kill that man. You mean I got to keep going up with the scale? No, sir, he's already there. I'm not going to give him 450 volts.
The experiment requires that you continue.
I know it does, but that man is hollering in there, sir.
As I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not dangerous.
I mean, he's yelling in there.
Start with blue, please, at the top of the page. Continue, please, teacher.
I think you can see what the problems in this experiment are. Now, Milgram himself ran this experiment in various variations. There have been attempts, so-called, to reproduce this, but they are absolutely not plausible. So the required reading includes an account of a recent non-replication of the Milgram study. In these studies, the kind of intervention will be greatly attenuated, will be much weaker. And look at those diagrams. There's women involved. Harry Harlow studied only monkeys. Milgram studied only men. The next study we'll be looking at used only men. In fact, the history of social psychology has only very recently recognized women as members of the human species. I want you to read the account of the pseudo-replication of the Milgram study very carefully and to note how much has changed from the original study and to ask yourself whether this is an experiment or a piece of theatre. But, as usual, we want to ask in social psychology, why did this happen? The experiment was done in 1961, published in 1963. Now, it's a long time now since the Second World War, but in 1963, that was only 18 years after the end of the Second World War. It's very difficult for us to imagine what a shock to everybody in the world the horrors of the Holocaust and the damage done by the Second World War occasioned. It appeared that an entire nation had gone mad. There was an urgent need to understand the role of authority, ideology, the system in some sense, in influencing people's behavior. The Nuremberg trials were held directly at the end of the Second World War, but there was a continuing process of dealing with the issues from the Second World War. And right in 1961, 1962, in a great wave of publicity, one of the most notorious of the Nazis, Adolf Eichmann, was on trial in Jerusalem. He was later hanged. The trial attracted an awful lot of attention. The philosopher Hannah Arendt attended it and published widely on the conduct of the trial. So the motivating factors behind this have to do with how the structures of authority might interact with an individual will or an individual conscience. Now, one could object in 1,000 different ways that this experiment is not suited to ask that question. And you will be absolutely right. There's an awful lot wrong with this experiment. But in order to understand why it was done, we need to understand the motivation. Please don't take from this that we learned anything from this experiment. We did not learn how authority and individual will work. That was not the outcome of this. It was a mode of questioning that allowed people to think about the role of authority and about the people, but it did not establish scientific results of any tenable kind. In social psychology, the science is often problematic, but we need to always to remember the motivation for the work. What are the fears it's responding to? And bear that in mind in the current situation, because COVID-19 is causing all kinds of fears. It's disturbing all kinds of systems, all kinds of habits, all kinds of forms of interaction and living. And there will be a vast amount of social psychology done on this time. You will come to such studies fresh with the knowledge of the situation of COVID, and they will look perfectly reasonable. Try to distance yourself from the situation somewhat. And recognize that these, as always in psychology, the questions are motivated by questions of care and concern, but try to make a distinction between the motivation and the actual science that's done. It seems to be wise.